While I hope you affirm and believe that song to be true, that the name of Jesus is powerful, if we're honest, there are times where it's difficult to really feel that is true. And I would say probably the most obvious or one of the most prevalent times where we can have difficulty in expressing that as true is when we feel alone or isolated. When it's just me by myself, it's hard to feel like there's power, like there's encouragement, and like it's something that I can do moving forward. Now we all have these moments of feeling alone. And as a pastor, you know, those thoughts are commonly creeping into my mind, and people are usually pretty sympathetic to that and encouraging on that. And what I have found is part of the difficulty in being a pastor is that people are emotionally connected to things that don't really matter. That if they weren't involved in that church, they would say, well, that's trivial. And the most obvious examples are that of the color of the carpet, the color of the paint on the wall, and those types of things. I remember at our church in Illinois, we replaced the carpet in the sanctuary, and it wasn't like a huge bickering, but there was some disagreement on the color of the carpet, literally, of which color we should do. And so we got through that, and we replaced the carpet. And then about a year or two later, we decided we needed to replace the carpet in the office. And the office was next to the foyer, which had the new carpet. And so instead of trying to figure out what should we do, I said, we're just going to get the same carpet we already got and put it in there to make it easier. So I didn't want to have any debate. We already decided this was adequate carpet for the church, so we're just going to continue it on into the office. And it was one of those things, I just kind of chose the path of least resistance. Now, one of the things that I have found that can be isolating in ministry is the fact I always have the question of, am I doing anything that makes a difference? Now, I'm getting to a greater point, and my point is not to get compliments. My point is not for you to give me an attaboy after the service. My point is to recognize that we all have these moments of isolation, of self-worth. Am I doing anything that matters? Whether we're talking about the church or whether we're talking about your house, your job, whatever else you're involved in, we have these questions of, am I worth anything? Do I matter? Am I making a difference? And I think that's a reality that can creep into our lives more often than we necessarily recognize. We're isolated, we're alone. It brings us to be unsure, and unconfident. And really, it brings discouragement into our lives. And what I think has been happening over the last year or so, and maybe longer than that, maybe this is just a trend that as always happens, is that we've spent so much time trying to figure out the world that we're missing what God wants to do in our lives. That we spent so much time trying to figure out how to navigate whatever that is in the world, that we are so consumed by that whatever God has for us, we're missing or we're not hearing clearly. And I think one of the people in the Old Testament that can really show us what this looks like is Elijah. Elijah is a prophet in the Old Testament who did a lot of powerful things. But the context in which he was a prophet was pretty precarious. See, he was a prophet during the reign of King Ahab. Man, I'm sorry, I got something caught in my throat. But in 1 Kings chapter 16, Ahab gets introduced, and we find that he's not a real good character. It says, Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. He not only considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, but he also married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and began to serve Baal and worship him. He set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal he built in Samaria. Ahab also made an Asherah pole and did more to arouse the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than did all the kings of Israel before him. Everything about him is negative. He did things completely contrary to God, and that's how he functioned. Now, we do need to recognize he was a very powerful king. A lot of times the Bible emphasizes the spiritual side of things and doesn't concern itself with some of the other things. But if you go to the historical records, the nation of Assyria actually identified Ahab as being a strong king and raised up a large army against them in 1853 BC at the Battle of Karkar. If you want a Jeopardy question for you. But so he was a powerful king, a force to be reckoned with. But all we really read about him is that fact that he was evil, that he did things against God. And so this brings Elijah in the next chapter, in 1 Kings chapter 17. He is grieved for the sins of Israel. He is grieved for how Ahab is leading the people away from God. And so he prays that as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word. So for over 3 years, there was no rain in Israel because of his prayer, because of how grieved he was for Israel's sin. We recognize water is a necessity in life. We have to have water. We can't function without it. Our bodies can't survive. But what was more important here was not the physical need, but the spiritual needs of the people. How they were so spiritually depraved, so spiritually away from God, that they were dying. They were killing themselves. So we need to make sure we don't allow our physical needs, our financial needs, our relational needs, whatever it is, any of our needs, we can't allow them to get in our way of God. And so Ahab and Elijah were not best friends, to say the least. They were completely opposite in their worldview. And it came to head in 1 Kings chapter 18 on Mount Carmel. If you remember this story, it's a pretty interesting story. So Elijah has basically a competition, throws down the gauntlet against the prophets of Baal. And it's Elijah on one side and the 450 prophets of Baal on the other side. And they have this challenge that both of them are going to get to build an altar, get wood for the fire, and sacrifice an animal on the altar. But the God they serve is the one who's going to provide the fire. So the prophets of Baal prayed to Baal. Elijah prayed to Yahweh. That's the Old Testament word for God. And so they both prayed to their God. And the prophet of Baal went first, and Elijah kind of had fun with it. He was mocking them pretty heavily. If you haven't read the story, I would encourage you to. It's in 1 Kings 18. But he asked them questions like, maybe your God is sleeping. Maybe you need to shout louder. Maybe he's busy. And just clearly things to mock them. And then when it came Elijah's turn to start the fire, before he did that, he poured 4 large jars of water on his wood. Now, we do have to remember that this was a time of during a drought. So water was precious. It was essential. But he poured 4 large jars, enough that it doused the wood, and then filled the trench around the altar with water. That was how much water there was there, to remove any doubt that this was just something that happened by chance. Elijah prayed, and God brought the fire, clearly showing that Elijah's God, Yahweh, was the one who was faithful, one who is to be served. And he sees the prophets of Baal and took care of them. And that's kind of how the story ends, because Elijah has to flee, because Ahab's not real happy. What had happened is Elijah had showed Ahab that the God he was serving was false, that what he believed to be true was not. And I think this highlights an issue that many people have. Most people in our world are not true 100% atheists. There are some, don't get me wrong, but most people believe in the concept of God, or that there is something else out there. Most people do. And so the issue is not if people believe in God. The issue is loyalty and allegiance to the one true God that is Yahweh. That God demands 100% loyalty. He is the only God, the one true God. There's nothing else other than Him. And so when we go against that, we separate ourselves from God. But the issue for Elijah, he flees because Ahab and Jezebel want to kill him. But the issue is that this was not a complete victory, because there were still people that were living contrary to God. There were still people who were doing things that were sinful, needed to be dealt with. So we come to 1 Kings chapter 19. And I'll start in verse 9. Because Elijah came to a cave and he spent the night there. The Lord said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Then I feel he had to build a soapbox or something just to make himself feel better about himself. Because his response was, "I have zealously served the Lord God Almighty. But the people of Israel have broken their covenant with you, torn down your altars, and killed every one of your prophets. I'm the only one left, and they are trying to kill me too." So God asks maybe somewhat of a rhetorical question when we consider the context of what's happening. Asks Elijah, what is he doing there? If we think of the recent events that Elijah has just experienced, they were intense. They were difficult. They were not easy. They were things that had caused him great distress, great fear in his life, most likely. And so he withdraws and he goes to this mountain. It's Mount Horeb, or Mount Sinai is another name for it. And it almost seems to parallel what Moses had done earlier when he received the Ten Commandments. He went and had this time with God, this time where Elijah and God were together. But in this moment, Elijah's humanity is on display. He's scared. He's frustrated. He's tired. He's discouraged. He doesn't know how to move forward from here. And I think we all can relate to that. At one time or another, that our humanity has been on display because we have withdrawn and gotten frustrated. But if you think of Elijah and his ministry, it would make sense that he has rubbed people the wrong way, that he's made a few enemies along his journey. Zeal is something that if you agree with it, you love. But if you don't agree with it, you hate it. Whatever that may be, whether it's a sports team, whether it's financial decisions, whether it's religion, whatever it is, if somebody has zeal that you agree with, you like it. But if somebody has zeal that you don't agree with, it bothers you and frustrates you and creates a huge disconnect in your relationship at best. But this word zeal that is used to describe Elijah's ministry and service to the Lord is also the same word that is used to describe God's jealousy for his people. When we talk about God as the one true God and anything contrary to that is sinful, it's God is jealous for his people. He is jealous that they would only serve him because he is the only legitimate thing to serve. So Elijah is doing his ministry zealously on behalf of God. So we do have to ask the question, is Elijah being self-righteous or is he displaying righteous indignation? Now we see God working through him, so I'm not trying to actually question his spirituality, but he is alone at this moment. He is withdrawn to a cave. He is by himself. His life is in danger. Ahab and Jezebel both want to kill him. And remember, Ahab is a pretty powerful individual. He's not just some scrub. He has a huge army at his disposal. He can go and he can kill and seek out this Elijah who is bothering him. And that's a real threat because Elijah has just basically told Ahab everything he does is false and illegitimate. But then Elijah kind of does something that he has a pity party, if we're honest. Said that the people of Israel have killed all the prophets of Israel. I'm the only one left and they are trying to kill me too. Well, that just simply wasn't true. But see, he had withdrawn. He had been discouraged. He had let the discouraging situation consume him so he couldn't see clearly. Because just a few verses earlier, in chapter 18, we see that Obadiah actually saved 100 other prophets. So that there were others that were trying to serve God. Now, the prevailing approach was to serve Baal or false gods. But Elijah was consumed by his circumstances. He was allowing the discouraging, the frustration, those things to consume him and allow him not to see clearly. So God responds to him. He says, "Go out and stand before me on the mountain." And as Elijah stood there, the Lord passed by, and a mighty windstorm struck the mountain. It was such a terrible blast that the rocks were torn loose, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, there was a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, there was the sound of a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And the Lord asked Elijah, "What are you doing here?" So God would pass by. His presence would be made known to Elijah. Elijah was discouraged. He was frustrated. He did not know what to do, how to handle the situation, what his next step should be. He didn't know probably if he had the strength to continue. Now we recognize God's presence brings encouragement. There are many people over the years who have expressed, I love coming to church. It gives me an emotional boost for the rest of the week. And while I think that's true, I think there's benefits in the emotional side of things of just coming to church and worshiping. God's presence includes an emotional boost, but it's deeper than that. It's not just something that makes you feel good. It's something that moves you, that motivates you, that challenges you, that inspires you. All of those things come from God's presence. And His presence was going to come before Elijah. So it came in the wind. Now the Old Testament word for God is Yahweh. And the word Yahweh, it has breath in it. Yahweh is more kind of appropriately how you would say it. And so we see in God's name there's breath, there's life, there's wind. But God wasn't in the wind. Here in Burlington specifically, we experienced part of the derecho that came through this summer. Some of you had damage on your property, but we didn't get the full brunt of it. Go 50 miles north and it's a much different story. And even as powerful as that was, it still doesn't compare to who God is. But even in the most powerful moment, God wasn't there. God was not in the windstorm. He was not in the storm that tore the rocks loose. And then there was an earthquake. Personally, I've never experienced an earthquake or the tremors, the aftershocks that come after it. But it's something that I think would be cool to experience some minor aftershocks once and be like, all right, that's good enough for me. I don't need to get any closer to an earthquake. That's good enough for me. And there are things we can do to minimize the damages that earthquakes can cause. But in general, if the earth's going to move, there's not much we can do about it. But even though there's an earthquake, something that shook the rocks, something that moved the earth, God was not in the earthquake. Then there was a fire. And if we were going to choose, maybe the fire is the one we would choose. This is how God would appear. Because many of the times in the Old Testament, when God makes an appearance, He comes with fire. But God wasn't in the fire. The fire is powerful. It can purge. It can destroy. It can give warmth. It can do all these things, but God wasn't in the fire either. He was in the gentle whisper. Now, the literal translation for gentle whisper is sound of sheer silence. I'm not exactly sure how to experience that. We live in a world with so much noise pollution that actually hearing nothing is almost impossible. I mean, if I'm around the house, in the office, a lot of times I have music going on. But if you go outside, you'll hear birds chirping. You'll hear traffic. You hear all these things. And right now I can hear the furnace going in the closet right back there. But not that you needed to know that, but it just shows that even when we're not thinking about it, there's noise all around us. But Elijah experienced the presence of God with sheer silence. This is the Almighty that can calm the storm within. This is the Almighty who can tear the rocks apart. This is the Almighty who is so powerful and so gentle at the same time. That is who Elijah experienced. So God asks him the same question. What are you doing here, Elijah? And while if God only asks that question once, it becomes a rhetorical question, I think the second time he asked it shows that there are spiritual implications for what God is getting at with Elijah. Elijah is discouraged. He is frustrated. He's alone. He has withdrawn. and God's presence is getting ready to shake things up in his life. But this reaction of Elijah is natural. It's natural to withdraw. It's natural to be discouraged, to be frustrated. And so Elijah responds with the same thing he said earlier. He said, I have zealously served the Lord God Almighty, but the people of Israel have broken their covenant with you, torn down your altars, and killed every one of your prophets. I'm the only one left, and they are trying to kill me too. And so the Lord responds. He tells Elijah, go to the wilderness in Damascus. When you arrive there, anoint Hazael to be king of Aram. Then anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, to be king of Israel. And anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, to replace you as my prophet. Anyone who escapes Hazael will be killed by Jehu. Anyone who escapes Jehu will be killed by Elisha. Yet I will preserve the 7,000 others in Israel who have never bowed down to Baal. So we see the solution that God presents. But Elijah reaffirms his withdrawal stance. He reaffirms his loneliness. He affirms his frustration of the almost woe is me situation. He had zeal, rubbed people the wrong way, didn't make a lot of friends. I'm not saying he did anything wrong, but his passion for God didn't sit well with people who wanted to do other things. And that's the reality of who God is. If people don't serve him, they don't like him, which is why he demands allegiance, why he demands loyalty to him. And so Elijah claimed his life was in danger, which was legitimate. Ahab and Jezebel wanted to kill him, wanted him dead, wanted to remove him. But God was getting ready to do something. He was getting ready to move. He was getting ready to put his plan in place. See, God was going to use these other leaders to address the situation that Elijah was confronting. See, Elijah had spent his life confronting the sins of the people, and now he was worn. He was tired. So he didn't know what to do anymore. So as God was promising this plan, he also told Elijah, hey, I'm going to protect the people that are faithful. Even though you think you are alone, you are not. God said, I'm going to take care of them and make sure that they are provided for. So Elijah's mission was to go and anoint 3 people. Anoint Hazael, king of Aram, anoint Jehu, king of Israel, and anoint Elijah to basically take his job. So we see that Elijah, I don't know how the translation is in the Old Testament in the Hebrew, but I wish the Elijah and Elisha would be a little bit different when you're talking about them, especially because they're so closely related. But anyway, so if I stumble, I apologize for that. Elijah's ministry was getting ready to come to an end. And so he needed to do these 3 next things in order for what he had been working towards to continue. See, too many times when we have a problem, when we have frustrations, when we have difficulty, we want God to show up in the mighty windstorm or the earthquake or the fire. God was going to deal with this problem in a way that we might consider boring. Prophetic succession, king succession is how God was going to deal with this problem. He was just going to slowly move the sinful people out of their place and deal with them. You know, we want God to bring the hammer down right now. So we withdraw and we complain and we get frustrated and we share our laments with God. Do it now. And God says, relax. But really, I think that there's hope that's built into this. Because as Elijah is doing his ministry, as he's being the prophet of Israel, what God is telling him, saying, you have done a great work, and I'm going to continue that work. Instead of just bring down the hammer, dealing with it, and then you ride off into the sunset and that's it, your work is bigger than you. This world we live in is bigger than any of us. And I think we recognize that in general. But when we think of the spiritual ramifications, the God we serve and the plan than any of us. God has a plan for you. And the great thing about the plan that God has for you is it started long before you ever existed, and it will continue long after you pass from this earth. The God's plan for you is not just the years you have on this earth. You're part of the bigger picture that God has given this world. And that is part of the hope he wraps up with Elijah. But I think it's important we recognize what Elijah was confronting. And I think the drought, the lack of rain, highlights it pretty vividly for us. Because when we're without water, we will die in a short period of time. And so for 3 years, Israel had no water. They were physically suffering. But the lack of water was because of their spiritual health. How they were spiritually unhealthy. How they weren't where God wanted them to be. And whatever that is, whether we're talking about humongous sins or little compromises, our spiritual health can fall quickly. And we can follow other things that aren't exactly what we should be doing. And I would say again, as I said earlier, this last year or so has been a time where I think our eyes have very easily been removed from God. That we've spent so much time saying, how do we figure out the world, that we have forgotten to take time to figure out God in our life. Now, I'm not trying to condemn the church. I'm not trying to tell us that we are terrible people, but we need to recognize that there's something greater. In John chapter 14, Jesus says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. That's it. There's nothing else. Says no one comes to the Father except through me. Outside of Jesus, there's no truth, there's no life, and there's no way. So as we begin 2021, I want to challenge you, let's find the way. Let's find it again. But what we have to do, we can't wait for the windstorm. We can't wait for the earthquake. We can't wait for the fire. We have to hear the gentle whisper. In order to do that, we've got to be quiet ourselves. So we're going to end the service a little differently. If no one's going to force you to do this, but here's my challenge for you. Chris and Becky are going to sing the song Waymaker. Nothing's going to be on the screen. And if you are physically able and safely able to do this, what I'm going to challenge you to do is find a place to kneel. Wherever that is. If you're here in person, you want to come to the front, you can kneel at the front. But find a place to kneel. If you're on your couch, kneel at your couch. Wherever it is. And just allow God to speak to you during the song. Because I think that's what we need more than anything. You may be at a point where you're like Elijah and you're in despair. You're frustrated. But you know what will fix all that? Is this the presence of God passes by. So we have to be quiet. I mean, we can't be talking, but I'm talking about spiritually quiet in the presence of God. And this is an opportunity for God to pass by, for us to be encouraged, for us to be inspired, for us to be motivated, for us to be challenged. It's not a time just for us to be, I want to feel better about myself.